We've already talked a little bit about the whole if-then-else scenario. I don't want to be redundant since I've already covered that in that previous video. So we're going to skip down a little bit until we get to the else if scenario. So we've talked about our basic if-then-elses, and we've gone through some examples on that. In fact, I did this exact same thing in the other one, and I also talked about doing nested if-then-elses where you have nested conditions. But what I want to get to here is the else if scenario. This is a little bit different. This is evaluating multiple conditions within the same if statement. So it's not like a nested condition. It's doing them all in the same indentation level here. So we have if some condition, do this, else if the other condition, do this, else if, and so on and so forth. And then finally at the end you fall out and do the actual else. So here's an example, just checking a couple of numbers to see if they're equal. If num1 greater than num2, print this, else if num2 greater than num1, do this, otherwise last possible condition is that the two values are equal. So you can see the fundamental logic behind that. It's pretty basic. Here's one that's a little trickier, but makes more sense from a real life standpoint. This is a calculation of Social Security and Medicare tax on a paycheck. Because of the nature of the way these taxes are calculated, there's two conditions depending on whether or not you have reached $117,000 over the course of the year. Once you reach that, then your tax changes. So there's those two conditions that can be evaluated here. If your earnings are less than or equal to that, then your tax is this. Else if your total year-to-date earnings are less than that, you're going to get nailed for this much tax. And then they go on and do the same thing here with the Medicare because it has a similar kind of a formula. Two conditions. If this, do that. Else if this, do that. So it's a kind of more concise way sometimes of evaluating multiple conditions. Now you could have 3 or 4 else ifs. It doesn't matter. It'll go through them until it finds one that's true. In fact, here's an example using a grade point average. 3.9, 3.6, 3.3. One of those is either going to be true, or if none of them, then it'll fall down through and hit the else statement. So else ifs can be useful for evaluating conditions. Here's a flow chart of that. And this is all in your book. Okay, this is using input validation. This is an is-digit scenario. So we're going to use is-digit to guard against improper input. So we're going to ask somebody to enter a number and then enter a second number. People do strange things sometimes. They might hit the wrong key or just be messing around with the program, and they might put in a letter instead of a number. So your program can do data validation on the input by saying if num1 is digit and num2 is digit, then do the proper action. Otherwise, else if one of those is not true, you can do some error, prompt the user with an error message. And here they show the examples of how they tested to see which one was incorrect. Another thing that you can do with Python, which is kind of concise and a little bit potentially confusing the first time you see it, is just making a statement if 7. If 7, well, what does that mean, if 7? Well, realistically what they're saying here is not whether it's 7, it's whether it's 0 or not 0. So anything that's a non-zero is going to be true, where 0 is false. And if you remember when I was talking about how the programming languages typical will evaluate Boolean true to 1 and false to 0, this is kind of what I'm talking about here. So anything that's 0 or empty, this is another example. If something is 0 or if a list is empty, then it's going to be false. As long as it has something in it, some number above 0, or it's got some letter or string in it, it's going to come back as true. And that's the end of that quick, short little section.